I have opened the 10 for Etherpad for Sprint. This is the usual design meeting where we kind of talk about our design. If we have anything we want to review. Is this the right page?
For me, the join me screen is constantly flashing on and off.
Yeah, I have that too. Were you using the app or the web page?
The web page.
I've got the app.
I have the same thing when I use the web page versus the web app. It sits there and basically just cycles Rob's screen over and over and over and over and over again.
We get Rob's daughter, and
Yeah.
You request control from it? Perhaps. If you need, I have his credentials.
Let's see. One option is just to switch to the Etherpad.
Just fine.
And go from there, assuming, because it keeps kind of locking up my Firefox too. Let's see. So is everybody on the Sprint 1004 page?
Yep.
We'll go there. All right. So all right. Normally we do the sprint review stuff in the on the Thursday meetings. We usually do design discussion or topics here. And so I guess what I'll do is 10:09. So I'm just going to start putting in stuff here.
Please press key to remain in conference.
Huh. I don't know if that was me, but there we go. Discussion. Does anybody have any topics for discussion this morning?
You mean like design topics or anything?
Sorry. Design topics for this morning. I haven't really prepared any. We've been getting a lot of work on our team on preparing for the OpenStack Summit, and then finishing our Betty release and looking at our WOMA release, and all the while occasionally playing with Crowbar 2.0 stuff. The Crowbar 2.0 stuff, we've done a lot of investigation and initial effort on some of the testing infrastructure that we added to quite a bit in the last couple of weeks to help with a lot of the unit testing and stuff like that. So that's coming along. I guess we can talk about that some as a potential topic.
Yeah, I would definitely like to talk about that because I was kind of starting to write unit tests as well, just for the validation code for validating things like domain names and IP addresses. I just wanted to extend that to validate IPv6 addresses as well. And then it occurred to me, like I've written the patch, but I didn't really want to submit a pull request without some unit tests for it. Seems like a really obvious place where there should be unit tests.
Oh, yeah, all over the place there should be a lot of unit tests.
Yeah, so, for sure.
Okay, so we can talk about some of what we're doing there. It's mostly Crowbar 2.0 focused. So the effort into it of where we wanted to go. Doesn't preclude work on the 1X trees, but in general, Rob and I have been pushing it more on the future work and not the past work. But, okay, other topics? Did Edmund make it? He was asking for dial-in stuff, so I don't know if he made it or not. Okay. Okay.
It
sounds like he's on the other call.
It might be worth quickly chatting about what I was just talking to Greg about on Skype, like this the locking thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Any other requests, comments, thoughts?
That rubs up against the CMDB locking nodes, because you'd be locking whatever CMDB backend that the bar clamp has chosen.
Okay.
Please press any key to remain in conference.
To me or not? Okay. Let's see. Well, we can start with those and see where we get. And if people have others, we can throw them in. Let's start with some of the testing work. Doing the 2.0 framework is to encourage and start trying to get to the point where we can start gating on testing. And the initial focus was going to be on the web app components. And then since we found some testing for some of the chef components as well, with some of the stuff that OPSCO's doing with their chef spec, and also with the test kitchen, which we haven't pulled in, but it's looking interesting. And so we can talk about some of the work we've done there and where we want to go. And so right now, and as always, interrupt when and if you can. And we'll take questions and comments from there. Okay. Let's see. My brain will kick in a second. All right, so unit tests, or testing in general. So for the web app, we've started to add in the testing frameworks to allow us to do unit level and some integration level testing of the web app. These can be done either as part of running them on a system that you've installed the admin node, or we can also run them from the dev tool if you have a build environment. So the goal was to be able to get where we could run the unit tests without necessarily having to do a full admin node install. So what's there? We currently have some unit tests using the test unit capabilities that are kind of built into Ruby and work with Rails. There's some examples of that. Chris has been doing a lot of work on using the testing of the network models and model changes that he's been doing with that, and has pretty good coverage of that. And so that's been really useful. I started adding unit tests for some of the core models and found that the unit tests would get very hairy and complicated because of the lack of the ability to add in stubs and mocks. So I've added the RSpec set of tools as well as an option to run unit tests. And I think we'll probably, not we will, but I think we're going to encourage people to do the spec tests instead of from the framework, because Chris has a lot of good work in there. And so over time, we may try and convert those over to the RSpec-based tests. But with the ability to do mocks and stubs and kind of object level and code level replacement so that the unit test can be very focused, spec seems to be, or RSpec seems to be a better setup for that, or long-term. Plus, there's some additional tools that are better integrated with spec, like Factory Girl and Mocha and some of these other gems that let you do things like fixture injection, dynamic fixtures, and better mocking. So anyway, that's where those are. There's examples of those in the tree currently, and the expectation is that as we continue to build and refactor the 2.0 work, we'll extend those. The intent, or at least currently in my mind, how I've been driving these tests is that the unit tests / spec tests are intended to do your model validation, including our complex models, with the intent that, and maybe even some of the internal controller validation where appropriate, but things like API validation and the UI validation would be done through our BDD test system, which is Cucumber-esque, but is much more performant. And its setup is, and Wayne, one of our engineers, is working on getting some of the authentication methods in place so that those can be normalized, so that all of that stuff can be done in a single way, and makes more direct coherence with the whole system. But the goal would be in the BDD test where we would be testing the API flows, UI flows, validation of UI components, translations. All of those kind of things would be handled through our BDD test features. There's examples of those. There's a lot of things kind of in that already for testing, like the documentation system and navigation system as examples. It's nowhere near complete, but it's in the process of being built. The goal is that that would be, again, a gate to check-in, that as we add APIs, we would expect to have BDD features that would validate those API endpoints going forward. The last set of tests that we recently started looking into and adding, Andy and a couple other guys on the team were looking and saw the chef spec stuff, as well as Edmund at DT or Deutsche Telekom had noticed or been pinging to the list periodically about using chef spec and test kitchen as ways to try and do validation of our recipes so that we can have some testing and unit tests around the cookbooks themselves. I've pulled in the chef spec stuff into our testing. Test kitchen is going to take a little more work because it's more of a spin-up environment kind of thing, and that will take more effort. Allow you to write art spec-like tests against your cookbooks and then validate that the resources and other items get the appropriate content specified. And it allows you to basically run your converge phases and validate that based upon the inputs that you put on your node and other resources, allows you to then validate that the resources
Please press any key to
are
remain in
configured
conference.
correctly. It looks pretty powerful. I wrote one real quick for a simple recipe, and the Minicom recipe is now validated since it's really, really simple. But it actually gives us a way to potentially start doing some validation of our recipes and like platform-specific things as well, because you can change your node attributes on input and then have it run the spec as if it were running in a SUSE environment versus a Ubuntu environment versus a Red Hat environment, which would let us potentially find some errors earlier than later. Anyway, so that's kind of the breadth of testing that we've kind of put in place from a framework perspective. On top of that, I changed the dev tool recently so that there's a set of dev tool commands for setting up an environment, reloading that environment from the data section, and then running the unit tests from that environment. It runs all 4 of the frameworks. It assumes that you're running in an Ubuntu builder currently. I know, Adam, that's a problem, but we'll cross that bridge as we come to it. I don't think anything's really Ubuntu specific, but anyway, that's just what basically follows the Crowbar installer for how we install the application. So it uses the bar clamp installer code, so it acts as a kind of a unit test, functional test of the bar clamp installer as well, and lays out a Crowbar app into your temp directory, and then runs the Rails application if needed or the unit tests as needed. BDD, for example, needs a running Rails application that it can be pointed at, and so it will actually spin up a Rails app in development mode and we'll run BDD against it. Let's see. Right now, the results aren't fatal nor blocking. Victor has been pushing me to add the setup, reload, and run tests as a gate to your prep pull request. I'm not quite ready for us to do that yet, but it will be coming. So maybe not in the week to come or the month to come, but hopefully soon. Until we can actually get a better, I mean, that leads to a whole different topic, which I don't know if we want to get into right now, which is the kind of continuous integration build services stuff. But anyway, all right, there's that. Any questions or comments so far? Am I talking to the wind?
No, it sounds great.
No comment.
Okay. So the yeah. So currently, there's a couple of specs out there. There was actually a user spec for the devise-based users, which I pulled in, which I think is kind of interesting. It actually validates the user model and operation, which is kind of cool. So it's growing. Does it need more work? Almost definitely. But at least it's got some place to focus on now. And I've been trying to add just unit tests on the side without necessarily adding features to build coverage for what we've been already have in place. So.
Hey Greg. So at some point, Victor's suggesting that we will be able to gate check-ins on tests, and having passing tests.
So that's a deeper conversation. The first pass will be just as part of the DevTools prep request that we do as part of the initial kind of how how it sets up to do the actual pull request into GitHub, to make it as part of that code path, and it's going to figure out what needs to be updated, everything's updated, and about to tell you what all the pull requests need to be that you're about to create. This have these set up and run unit tests as part of that code flow such that it doesn't kick out the gen request line until the unit tests pass. As just the first pass at, did you run unit tests? Let's make sure you did before you generate a pull request.
That makes sense. Would we also then start
so that's the first
pushing back on code that was submitted without a certain amount of tests as part of the review process? I mean, that's
so,
a way
yeah.
to
So we've been doing that for certain sections of the code. So we've been doing that for like Chris's networking code that we haven't necessarily been gating the check-ins, but we've been kind of beating on him. So he's been willingly doing it, which is good. Updating and building the unit tests as he goes. His first set of check-ins were without unit tests, and then he added unit tests for those. And the recent set of check-ins have been paired where they've included both the unit tests and the code, finding that it's been good to write and test at the same time. The hope is that as the infrastructure gets more fleshed out, we will, and it's easier to run the tests, we'll have the expectation that they go hand in hand.
Thank you.
Hey, Greg.
Yep.
Hey, Jim. Do we want to coordinate with QA that every time we add a BDD or some kind of end-to-end test that they currently run manually, that we eliminate that from a manual test?
I think that is a great idea, which points to a different set of things that we internal to Dell need to figure out of, do we publish our QA external, our QA run methodology, our test sets and stuff like that so that we can try and synchronize those globally. But I think you're quite right that as we generate more and more automation, especially when it comes to the BDD part, because the BDD in general represents a much fuller end-to-end test than some of the specs, our specs and unit tests. So I think that's probably a really good thing we need to call out. Okay. All right, other questions or comments? I know it's not where we completely want to be, but it's a start down the path. But this is all 2.0 focused, right? So this is really testing in 2.0. Okay.
There's no action plan to backport testing into 1X at this point. This is entirely 2X. I'm looking at the past items that we had, and I'm not sure that there's any that we're ready to discuss. There's pull from source, but I was hoping to have Andy here, and we're going to cover that at the conference. Install process bootstrapping. Actually, that would be something that would be interesting to talk through. From what the idea that you've been floating about how to bootstrap. And then the other thing I would do is pull up the OpenStack Summit just as a reminder for people. And Adam, I know you're following along.
I've lost my connection. No, I've lost Etherpad connection. Yay.
Yeah, mine just bounced too.
Mine's okay.
wondering if our lovely Dell and IT policies have come about to bite us again. Hey!
I keep losing.
Oh.
I hit refresh and it comes back.
Okay. I'm kind of back.
It'll lose your last change though if you're not careful on it. I think it's actually on the sync in side.
Okay. Well, we can. There was a request to go over locking, and that's what we had written down as the next topic.
Sorry, I'm coming in late. I see it.
So now, and particularly, Adam and I were having a discussion on Skype about locking, and in particular, in their test environment, they can generate allocation requests before a node is completely discovered, causing the allocation request to get lost. So the specific problem here is that the node is in the middle of the transition call for discovering. And then there's an external process that's going to allocate that node once it's discovered, and is watching the node through, well, Crowbar and or Chef. It doesn't actually matter which in this case. And the node will mark itself as discovered, even though it's still in the middle of doing the transition function. And then the allocation will attempt to write the allocation flag on the node, well, in this case, the node role object, and the transition function will update that with its cached copy and blow away the change, causing the node to sit there unallocated. So there's lots of little side issues there. In our testing, we in general don't see that because we go through a manual allocation process and wait for 4 nodes to become completely allocated or spinning before we go do that. So we may, in our test framework, already work around this problem, and so have never really noticed it. This is a good find. It just points out that locking in our system is not enforced and really controlled.
So how do you wait for them currently?
My guess is that it's a side effect of let's wait for 4 VMs to get to the discovered state, then wait 30 seconds.
Okay.
I'd have to check our smoke test framework code, but that would be my guess on what's happening. Yeah. All right, so locking. Right now, there's one big lock, the VA lock, which we use to prevent nodes from transitioning on top of themselves, or the system really from transitioning on top of itself. But that's not sufficient because it's not currently locking, for example, the node operations, which, as Adam points out, there's a large disconnect between the API code in the machines controller and the node UI code in the nodes controller. Those are just disconnected, and you realize that machines is where kind of the API stuff lives, and nodes is where the UI lives in 1X. We're hoping to change that in Crowbar so that becomes unified and have a more rigorously defined node API so that some of this at least gets focused into one place. Okay. Those aren't synchronized with the transition function. So because we use Chef as a database, it has no locking semantics at all. So you can't really discover things have changed easily, or even at all, because of the weird caching structures they use for semantics. So the fundamental bug here is just straight that we're not controlling access to the node role structure and locking around that. And so two people change it and it gets lost. The 1X ironclad fix is to go through and find all the places where we load and save the node role and lock it and put a locking structure around it. That is a lot of work because we probably aren't checking that very cleanly. Another way to look at it is to do a holistic node lock. Similar problem, in theory, could be done in a few choice places to make this better, but it's also going to be lots of changes in the machine's API, potentially the node controller API, or the node controller, the machine's controller, and then the Crowbar controller. There's a few other locking places that occur. For example, the network bar clamp takes locks on its data bags so that it can control what goes in the IP addresses and how they're allocated. That locking is fairly clean in the sense that all of those changes are currently coordinated through that one path. So locking in there in that network bar clamp is good. And it's that request specific. So locking in that context is very focused. It's not global. The other problem with the VA lock is that it's also used to control queue access. So as part of the transition function, if a node goes to ready, we will attempt to do queuing and dequeuing, really, in which case we will take the big lock and manipulate the queue. The VA lock is reasonably effective for controlling queue access around applying proposals and dequeuing and enqueuing the proposals. It was not necessarily meant to handle or control this level of the node locking. So in the end, the bug is just straight up, we don't do node locking very well.
Yes.
There is some node locks inside the queue, particularly around the state change. So if you change state of a node, that is locked. The problem is allocate is a equivalent thing to state and isn't locked the same way. So one option may be to look and see if we can pull some of the node lock functions that we're using currently to control state change and widen their kind of arbitrary scope to include the allocate flag, and then go wrap everywhere we change or touch the allocate flag to be locked. So anyway, that's a long rambling discussion on locking in 1X. Now in 2X, locking gets different and more controllable. There's a lot more tools available. The 2X locking, so as Judd pointed out, and when we were talking about the topic initially, there's CMDB locking now, as well as our data structure reference locking. The idea there is Crowbar will lock control the access and storing of its data structures. Now this gets easier because we can do things like active record optimistic locking and transactional locking on those kind of things, which we couldn't do with Chef as our database. So I'm not sure we've put all of that in place, but it's definitely something that we can start using and taking advantage of. We also have a much more centralized load and save set up so that we can at least do a better job of tracking who's grabbing and controlling those nodes or those data structures. So that's one thing. Second thing is the data structures have gotten a lot more separated. We had a single monolithic data structure, which means you have to have, in general, a single monolithic lock everywhere. Now, for example, the node role structure, as it existed in 1X, has become node role proposal objects that are unique for each node inside the context of their own proposal. This is particularly useful for things like, I want the networking bar clamp to change the node role. Well, I don't have to lock the node. I can lock the network bar clamp's little section of that so that it can then make a change there and then notify the CMDB system that it needs to rebuild the downstream stuff, and however it wants to do that, either as a post function or before calling Chef client or whatever. All that now is separated. So the context of locking has got a lot smaller so that it can be much more focused on smaller windows and smaller operations. So that, too, is also something that's changing in 2.0 that makes this problem different. I won't say completely better because there's pluses and minuses. I think it's better in the long run, but it'll mean that some basic patterns will be need to put in place around data flow and control. And then the specific parts of the CMDB, the goal is to make the CMDB with regards to configuration, which is kind of what this part is, write only. So the idea is that since the CMDB abstraction layer is controlling when these Chef client runs occur, it can control making sure that a consistent set of data is written out to the CMDB and operated on from the other data sets. Blech. Sorry. I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that's useful, but there's the repented kind of state of locking.
Yeah, that's really useful.
Adam, this is something that you're looking at as a 1X fix?
Well, yeah, I mean, for now, I raised it because of that particular issue with 1X, but obviously it's something that we want to understand how it's going to work for 2 as well.
Yeah. I mean, using Chef as a database has caused us with race and lock conditions. For the whole, that's been an ongoing challenge. So it's a big part of the rationale for the 2X change.
Sure. I was wondering if there are any tricks we could pull with 1X to add some kind of safeguards or at least sanity checks with a minimum amount of effort. For example, maybe subclassing the Chef node and role classes with just a thing that basically, just a wrapper class that every time you call save, it does some sanity checks that, locking in conjunction with checking the serial number or something like that, the revision number. Because, I mean, the way that I spotted this race today was I was looking at the revision numbers, each time each thread was incrementing the revision number, but due to the lack of locking, that revision number was not being, it wasn't universal, it was just per thread, so one of the threads ended up effectively reverting to the state of previous revision. So I don't know if there's a trick we could pull with that, rather than having to go through the whole code base looking for every place where a node or a role gets saved, just to, wrap the actual save method and add something in there.
Yeah, so maybe. I'm not sure completely how successful that would be. Just because of the weird loading problems that we have. But the whole set of those revision numbers was based around that, so that you could make sure that you were moving forward. My thought is you could make something that would explode, but I'm not sure you could make something that would be survivable. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I suspect too. But I don't know, maybe at least that way during the QA phase we could catch stuff. Or, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily have to explode, but it could at least, log a big warning saying, hey, this looks like some kind of race condition here.
Yeah, and so that I think is possible in the current code that's there now with the revision numbers, so that you could load a side object of the thing, right? So that you could say, okay, this is what I'm about to save. Let me load it and see what its values are. Now, I think that will work with Chef because they're not really caching the objects. That methodology works less well with Active Record. But Active Record has better tools for this anyway.
Yeah.
Would we have Solar indexing issues? Because part of what we were encountering was time lags in actually building the indexes. Getting materials back from Solar.
We used to do that and used to have that problem, but the web app only does a search in one location for normal operation. It will potentially affect what the UI displays, but it won't affect the transition or allocate operations. Those don't use search.
Right. So that's
we basically don't use search except for in one place for that purpose. And it's searching roles and not nodes. So because of that very issue.
Sometimes I think we're the only customer that they have.
Well, we're definitely seems like I'm not sure how people automate this stuff.
Oh, that's not what I meant. Sorry, I meant the Crowbar sync in, which is going nuts on me and losing my typing.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, no.
So
Chef,
Adam, I lied.
Chef is. I don't think this is Chef's expected use case.
Right. Most definitely. So while we could be setting node locks in the 1x code, we use the BA lock for controlling queue access. For everything. There isn't even a node lock anymore. And yep, we use that globally for manipulating the nodes.
We're just about out of
A quick question, maybe a direction for thought. With proper locking, can we bring search back, or is search still at that orchestration level that we're interested in dissuading people from using in the CMDB?
Search. Proper locking doesn't fix the search failings. Proper locking just makes sure that when we load directly or save directly the objects that we get back what we want, make sure we want, and make sure nobody overwrites anything. Search, because of the Solar indexing, which I know Edmund and I think the SUSE guys as well, have posted ways to speed up the indexer. But I still think there's a search condition there that if you got sufficiently loaded or sufficient nodes, that indexer will lag behind, and doing searches can get you in trouble.
It's supposed to be eventual consistency.
Search within Crowbar will be safer because we will have control over it, and we're using a database. Chef will get better when they switch when the public chef actually switches to using the real database. And so I think it'll get better, in which case then I think we can reevaluate whether we search. Search is a little counter to the attribute-driven recipe stuff that we've talked about. So we'll have to balance that as we go forward. Anyway. Yeah, it looks like the BA lock is it in 1X. Though the locking, you could make a per node lock. We just don't have one. We don't use one.
So, I mean, we need a quick kind of workaround we need to tweak our CI suite in some way just so that we can make sure we're not trying to allocate before nodes are finished transitioning to discovery. So is there some simple thing we could do for that? What's the quickest way of solving that?
Does your QA system check the node state to see if it's settled before it advances? Or?
Yeah, that's the problem. That's where the race is, because currently it does a nice node show and then just checks the state attribute. But of course, that can be updated before the transition thread is completed.
There is a UI call or an API call that you can do to see the node states. It'll return a JSON document, and if you use that as your governor, that would make sure that
no, it's not sufficient.
It's not. Okay, then I just don't understand.
Nope. Well, because what happens is we set the node state at the beginning of the transition function, and then the transition function continues running and moving along, still doing things to the node's role object.
Oh.
And then they call allocate, which changes the node role object, even though the transition function is not done.
I didn't realize the timing issue was that tight. Okay. Yeah, you're right. You'd have to do that plus some arbitrary back off and hope.
So that's what I'm trying to see right now. Anyway, Adam, I'll look some up in our framework and see what we do and how we allocate the nodes and how we delay in that case.
Okay, thanks.
Because we do a cheesy thing.
Okay. I mean, I think for 1X, we're not looking for like the perfect solution, but just something that can, if we're aware of the locking issues and we can work around the ones, that we're encountering in our sort of daily or hourly automated test cycles, then, that's going to be a good step forwards, and then for 2.x we get the benefits of the active record.
Okay. All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left. If we have other topics we can't go into, I can check this offline and have a quick answer. But
so for potential topics, this is our backlog list that we've and maintaining. There's still network issues, but the person who's been asking about that isn't on the call. That was Edmund. Dev process discussion we've been having. Security considerations we haven't had yet. Merging ISO builds, we had that a little bit online. It probably needs some just people on it. Awesome. That's going to be cool. Install process bootstrapping, I think would be interesting to discuss and get that a little bit vetted from an idea perspective. We don't have time. Oh, we're not having these meetings next week because of the OpenStack conference. We'll try and do something face to face instead. Please make sure you update the OpenStack page. We've been talking about builds, core workflow, and jobs. I think that we're holding on that until Greg's ready for design and review discussion on that. Hey, Greg, thank you for kicking off the call. I really appreciate it. Sounds like you guys covered a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Cool. Hopefully that was useful. And see some of y'all. Well, are we still doing the Thursday call?
Oh, that's a good question. Considering we're just doing OpenStack next week, we could skip it. Yes, unless somebody wants to do it, I would suggest we skip it. Because mostly what we're going to do is talk about OpenStack, and that we can't make those decisions until we're there. The only question I would have, Greg, is if we want to do it more. I don't want to bring design items into that meeting because it's not supposed to be it. I'd rather just postpone and cancel. Adam, that cool with you?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I just had one idea, which take it or leave it, but it just popped into my head earlier. In terms of like the ship readiness and tracking, you know, what's done, what's in progress, and sort of getting a shared view on all of those items. So we actually use Trello for tracking our backlogs to some extent. I don't know whether you've ever tried Trello or used it, but it's a great tool. You know, it could potentially work nicely for tracking all the 2AX stuff, but you know, maybe you already have something.
We definitely do not publicly have anything. That would be really so. Let's do this. Let's talk about the ship ready list on Thursday. Review it and potentially is Trello publicly accessible?
Yeah, it's just free. You know, you can create public or private boards. I think it's definitely free, and it's going to stay indefinitely free. And it's a pretty cool tool for this kind of thing.
Let's make Thursday's meeting dedicated
Andy looked at it
to ship readiness, and then we'll see about populating Trello as a tracking tool for the ship ready list. I think that's a great idea. I think it would be a good preview discussion to have before we have face-to-face at Summit. Yes. Good suggestion.
Okay.
All right. With that, it's time to wrap up. Everybody, thank you for joining me. Joining Greg today. And I'll talk to you all on Thursday.
Don't forget.
All right. Thanks.